Hey everyone! So this morning we are going to be talking about efficiency, equity, and cost-benefit analysis. So this is a way that we begin to assess those policy alternatives that we talked about in the last lecture. Right? It's a way to be able to decide which is the best policy, the best way to address a particular problem. So by the end of today, you should be able to do the following. You should be able to define efficiency as it relates to policy. You should be able to explain the trade-offs between efficiency and equity. You should be able to understand the principles of cost-benefit analysis, understand when you would use cost-benefit analysis, and understand the strengths and limitations of cost-benefit analysis. So let's jump right in and get started. So what is cost-benefit analysis? So cost-benefit analysis is the most common way to analyze policy. So it's the thing that policy analysts use the most often. And we can think about it in pretty informal way and apply it to our own life, and then think about it in a formal way. So in the informal way, you can think about pros and cons, right? When you are trying to make a decision in your life, maybe you make a list of pros and cons about each choice, right? So to use this example more correctly, think about, if you're trying to decide to break up with your significant other, you might make a pro and con list, right? What would be the benefits of doing this? What would be the cons of doing this? In cost-benefit analysis, what we're doing is taking that principle of trying to figure out, what are the pros and cons, and we're formalizing it, okay? And so to do that, we are going to monetize or give a monetary value to the things that are good and the things that are bad. So as the name would imply, the pros are our benefits and the cons are our costs. The key to this is that it gives us a way to compare dissimilar things. And so, for example, in the case of breaking up with your significant other, if on the benefit side, a benefit of being with your significant other is that you don't feel lonely or that they make you laugh, right? And a con is that it's a long distance relationship. Well, how do you compare those two things? How is it that you decide what is more valuable? Is the benefit better or is the cost better? And if you want to do that in a really objective way and figure out are there more pros or more cons, then it's really difficult to do because it's very hard to compare these dissimilar things. Well, a cost-benefit analysis allows us to take those dissimilar items and give them a monetary value. And the monetary value allows us to add up, are there more costs, are there more benefits in an objective way. So this is an idea that comes from economics, and because it comes from economics, the driving consideration is efficiency. Okay, and we're going to talk about what efficiency means, because like many things in the academy, the formal or academic definition is not necessarily the kind of definition that we use in common language. So what do we mean by efficiency in an academic sense? So efficiency is the allocation of scarce resources in a way that maximizes the resulting net benefits of that resource allocation. And so what does that really mean if you break it down? Well, the goal is to provide the largest benefit to a policy's target group relative to the cost. Okay, so it just means that if you're going to have an inequality, right, if you're going to write out an equation, the alligator would be eating the costs. The benefits. That was a really odd way to say that, but so what we're looking for is a Pareto efficient, ideally, outcome. And so in the reading, this is explained in a much greater detail. But in a Pareto efficient outcome is when it's not possible to make any individual better off without making another individual worse off. So what you're trying to do is maximize your benefits, minimize your costs, and find that happy place where you can't increase the benefit anymore without creating additional costs. Okay? And this is ultimately the goal of a cost-benefit analysis. So these are when our policy analysts assess these things, they're trying to find the policy that is going to maximize the benefits while minimizing the costs. One of the things that we have to be aware of is this concept of dead weight loss. And this is when the losers lose more than the winners win, right? And so what we mean is that this is a measure of inefficiency, okay? So what we're trying to do is avoid inefficiency. And what we mean with dead weight loss is that it occurs when the loss of welfare imposed on one party exceeds the gain in welfare afforded to another party. Okay, and so essentially what you're talking about is that there is a more efficient allocation of resources or of costs and benefits that could make at least one person better off without making anyone else worse off. Okay, and so a classic example of dead weight loss is minimum wage. So the reality of minimum wage is that it is a technically inefficient policy because there are some workers who are not hired at $7.50 because the business can't afford to hire multiple workers at that price. But that they would have been hired and they would have worked if the minimum wage was lower. So let's say the minimum wage was $3.75. Well, there would have been 2 workers who would have been employed rather than that 1 worker who was employed for $7.50. And so the minimum wage distorts the labor market by raising the wages of many workers at the expense of their employers while leaving some workers without jobs. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later on about this because clearly the efficiency is not the only consideration. And we have a minimum wage not for the most efficient outcome, but because we have identified that as a value, right? We say, okay, there is a rate at which anything below this is exploitation. And we as a society don't accept that, right? We say, okay, people should at least be able to buy food or at least be able to have minimum shelter. And in order to do that, they need to make a minimum wage, right? And so there are many other considerations besides efficiency. But if we are assessing a policy simply from the efficiency perspective, what we're looking for are places that are inefficient, right, as a result of the structure of the policy. And minimum wage is a great example of that. And so in this example of minimum wage, those who would have been hired at a lower wage represent dead weight loss, right? So these are those individuals who are being lost, right? The efficiency is being lost. So the benefit to those workers of having employment is lost because we're giving a greater income to the ones who are already employed. So let's go over the basics of a cost-benefit analysis, right? So we already talked about the guiding tenet of cost-benefit analysis is efficiency, and you're wanting to minimize inefficiency and dead weight loss. But there are 2 basic premises on which cost-benefit analysis is built. So the first Okay, let's try that again. So there are 2 basic premises. The first is that if benefits of a policy exceed costs, then society will be better off, okay? And the policy that maximizes benefits while minimizing costs is the best policy. So the way that we are going to choose the policy that is going to address a problem is by adding up the value of benefits and the value of costs and comparing them. When the value of benefits exceeds the value of costs, that is a policy that we're going to choose. And so let's think about this informally with the decision to attend college. So when you were deciding whether or not to attend college, there are probably many considerations. If you were doing a formal cost-benefit analysis, you would first add up the costs. Okay, so we can think about this as tuition, room and board, maybe you need a car, maybe you have books, you have miscellaneous expenses, but you also have the value of foregone work, right? So instead of working 40 hours a week, you are maybe working 10 hours a week or maybe not at all. So you have a cost of, it's an opportunity cost, right? It's the value of what you would be doing if you were not in school. And then you would add up the value of the benefits. So, you're getting skills for your preferred career, you're increasing your earning potential, you're increasing your knowledge, etc., right? And so if your benefits are greater than your costs, college is a good choice. If they aren't, then college might not be a good choice. If, for example, it's going to cost you $100,000 to go to college, and really what you want to be is a plumber, and you could gain that knowledge and the skills need for your career and maximize your earning potential in some sort of a apprenticeship program, well, then college maybe isn't the right choice, right? Okay, so there are a couple of assumptions that underlie cost-benefit analysis that are essential in understanding how you might go about completing a cost-benefit analysis. So the first is that we can monetize all potential costs and benefits. And what monetization means, right, if you think about that word and break it down to its core, right, money, right, think about money and monetization. So what you're doing is you're adding a monetary value to your costs and benefits. The second is that we can use probability to account for the chance of success or failure. And what that means is that we can use probability to account for potential outcomes and varying outcomes. We're going to talk more specifically about what that means. The third is that we can account for the future value or cost of assets and benefits, and that we can take those into consideration in our cost-benefit analysis. So it's not just about the costs and benefits in the present moment. It's also about what happens in the future, and that the assumption is that we can account for that accurately. And finally, the final assumption is that we can use compensation for losses to achieve optimum results. And so as we'll talk about, you don't have to actually give that compensation, but the assumption is that if there are winners and losers in a particular policy scenario, that you can give compensation to the losers to make them indifferent to that policy. And that in doing that, you can create an optimal solution that maximizes efficiency. So, as I've just mentioned, what monetization means is that we express a cost or benefit in dollar form. The reality, though, is that some things are really easy to monetize. So let's continue on with our example of college. So the cost of your tuition, depending on whether or not you are an in-state or out-of-state student, is between about $13,000 and $34,000 a year. Okay, that cost is very straightforward. That is, when the bursar sends you a bill, you pay that bill. If you don't pay the bill, you get kicked out, right? That's a cost, a very straightforward monetized cost. But some things are very difficult to monetize because we don't know how likely an outcome is, right? So, for example, one of the benefits of going to college is that you are likely to increase your salary. But the value of your college education in terms of salary depends on what actually happens, right? And so what kind of a job do you actually get? Are you going to be a world-renowned neurosurgeon and make $500,000 a year or more? Or are you going to be, a lab tech making $25,000 a year? And because that's unknown when you actually enter college or you make that decision to enter college, it's difficult to monetize the value of your future salary. And the other thing, though, is that some things are difficult to monetize because they are intangible. And so what we mean by intangible is that they aren't easily measurable, right? They are not tangible. They aren't real things. I mean, they're real, but they're physical things, right? So in the college example, how much is your happiness about being educated or your relief to be independent from your parents worth? And how would you assess that, right? Because these are really intangible things. They're very important to you, but it's not like you can just go out and easily say, well, this is the value of that thing, right? And so monetization is far trickier than we think it is. And the assumption is that we're monetizing all costs and all benefits, no matter what. Okay, so keep that in mind as we move forward. And the next thing is using probability discounting. So anytime we make assumptions about the future, there is some level of uncertainty, right? So let's say that we are looking back and trying to figure out, what is your future, the increase in your future salary because you're going to go to college. And you say, well, I want to be a doctor, right? My plan is to go in, I'm going to get a pre-med degree, I'm going to then take I think it's the MCAT, right? Whatever. I'm going to take the test, and then I am going to go to medical school. Or I'm going to become a doctor. But you don't know. There's a level of uncertainty. Maybe you are going to figure out that actually you love political science and you're going to become a political scientist. Or maybe you're going to end up with an unexpected child and you're going to drop out of school. Or maybe you're going to find some other love, and maybe in engineering, or maybe you're going to take a biology class and realize you want to be a microbiologist, right? So there's some level of uncertainty about that outcome. We can transition uncertainty, so no one knows what will happen, into risk, which means that we know how likely potential outcomes are using probability. And so probability allows us to develop expectations based on past experience, similar circumstances, etc., about how likely an outcome is. And so how much money will your college degree make you? So let's say that we have figured out probability discounting, and we say, well, there's a 90% chance that you will become a high school English teacher. Let's say you have an English major, right? 90% chance you're going to become a high school English teacher. You're going to make $45,000 per year. But there's a 10% chance that you will become a college English professor at the top of the field and make $150,000 a year. Right, so we would have developed those probabilities based on our existing knowledge of how the average person does, how people who are like you do, so based on your test scores and things. And so we're going to try and figure out, well, what are the costs and benefits of these options given what we know about the probability of the outcome. Okay? And so by developing probabilistic understandings of potential options, we can better evaluate our costs and benefits. So think about this is in a real tangible example. So the question is, should BP do offshore drilling in the Gulf? So this is a company's policy decision. It's also the government's policy decision in terms of whether or not to grant permits to do that, and even at a bigger, larger scale, whether or not to allow offshore drilling. So let's say that the cost is the possibility of a deep sea oil spill, like the Deepwater Horizon's oil spill, that would cost the company billions of dollars, untold numbers of billions of dollars. But the probability of that happening is 1/1000th of 1%. So a very, very, very low probability. In contrast, the benefit of doing that drilling is that they can access large oil stores and make BP millions of dollars in profits. And the probability of that happening is 99%. So then BP can look at it and they can say, well, the benefits are large and virtually guaranteed, and the costs are large but virtually guaranteed to not happen. And so they, as we saw with the Deepwater Horizon's oil spill, they made the choice, yeah, let's go do this offshore drilling. And there were a lot of other choices that they made along the way that likely have some degree of cost-benefit analysis, right? So they're assessing, are the costs worse or the benefits better? Okay. The next thing that we're doing is using time discounting. So in the other example, we're using discounting to figure out the costs and benefits based on the probability that an outcome happens. With time discounting, we're trying to take into account the fact that costs and benefits occur at different time periods, and that a cost today is going to have a different value tomorrow. So let's say, for example, that you pay tuition today of $50,000 over 4 years. And so that you are going to have so your total value or cost is $50,000 divided over 4 years. But on average, you will earn an extra $1 million over 40 years. Okay, so the cost is immediate and fairly substantial. The benefit is distributed over a much longer period of time. And so for a lot of people, they say, well, the cost is immediate. I'm going to have to pay it out of pocket. And the value of it, the benefit of it is going to be a long time coming. Not to mention that $1 million over 40 years because of inflation is not really going to have the same value that it has today. It's going to be significantly less money. So a lot of people look and they say, well, college is too expensive, right? The benefit is not great enough to me to pay the upfront costs. But in order to actually compare these things, right? So the 4 years, the $50,000 over 4 years versus a $1 million over 40 years, right? Because I just mentioned that you have this problem of inflation. So how do you compare $1 million over 40 years to this $50,000 up front? And we do that by expressing the value of both the cost and the benefit in present dollars. And so we assume a rate of inflation for the future. And so we figure out, well, given the rate of inflation, what is $1 million worth today, right? Or what is $1 million in 40 years worth today? And so by doing that, we can discount the future benefits and costs. What this reflects, though, is that people prefer consumption today to future consumption, and that invested capital is productive and provides greater consumption in the future. Okay, and so what that means is essentially if you take your money, you're deciding, should I spend my money or should I put it in the bank? Right, so that's your capital. Your money is your capital. And you decide to put it in the bank or put it into an investment because bank accounts are not very lucrative right now. So let's say you invested in property. And so that's going to accrue an additional value above and beyond the capital that you invested. And that's going to allow you to have increased consumption in the future. But because you value consumption today over future consumption, you may make the choice to spend that money instead of investing it. So even though your benefits in the long run might be greater than your costs, we do value that consumption in the present at a higher rate, right? And so analysts choose their discount rates. And so this is something to be a little bit leery of, because when you overvalue the present, or you give a low over, when you overvalue the present or undervalue the present, it's a way to manipulate your costs and benefits. Okay, so it's a way to say, I'm going to, if you need the costs to be, if you want to make a choice where the benefit is greater in the present moment, you are going to give a greater value to the present, right? You're going to say, okay, well, the benefits in the present are really a lot more valuable than the benefits in the future. Whereas if you want to choose the future option, right, we're going to do some policy, we're going to invest so that we can have money in the future, for example, then you have an incentive to undervalue the present and overvalue the future, right? And say, okay, well, our future benefits are really worth a lot more than our present costs. So it's just something to be aware of. One thing I do want to say, I probably should have said this at the beginning, is that this is just a primer in cost-benefit analysis. These are things that you should be aware of, but I'm not teaching you, obviously, how to do a cost-benefit analysis. It's not something you need to be responsible for. If you were going to go ahead and go into a master's of public policy, they would teach you how to do a cost-benefit analysis in those classes. So at this point, you just need to be able to understand the concepts of cost-benefit analysis. Okay, the final assumption is that we can use compensation to overcome opposition. So this is the Kaldor-Hicks principle, and what it does is allow for side payments to adjust for different preferences and disagreement about a policy decision. So a side payment is an amount of money needed to make someone indifferent to the alternatives. And so in the example that they give in the reading, it's about flowers, right? But you can think about, you can think about this in a lot of ways. So the cities and governments have the ability to take over people's property, right? They can use eminent domain when they have a public interest in mind. Okay, so for example, like they want to build a highway, you can take over a neighborhood to do that, right? You can, and the idea is that you're going to pay off those people because people don't want to lose their home, but you're going to pay them enough that they can be okay with that solution, right? Because they're incurring the costs of actually having their house torn down. But the government gives them a benefit, quote unquote, of paying for their home, right? Maybe giving a little more than market value. So according to the theory, though, you don't actually have to pay the compensation. There just has to be a sum that the loser would take to make them indifferent. So we have these kind of analogies all the time. So there was just a survey that said, how much money would it take for you to give up Facebook? And something like 45% of people said, well, $10,000 and I would give up Facebook forever. The other group, I think there were like 40% that said there's no amount of money that I would give Facebook up for. Okay, so what they're doing is they're giving they're obviously not going to really pay you, but they're making sort of a mind game, right? They're figuring out, well, how much is this worth to you? How much could we compensate you for giving up this thing that you have a benefit from, for incurring a cost of giving up Facebook? And for 45% of people, that side payment would be $10,000. Right? That's the value that they place on the benefit that they get from Facebook. But no one is ever obviously going to pay them to do that. So that's just a way to say, okay, if we were trying to make a policy where we took Facebook away, how much money would we have to pay, in theory, to get people to go along with it, right? So let's give an example. So let's pretend that you and your parents are disagreeing about your major. You want to study art and they want you to study engineering. And so you argue about this all summer and haven't been able to come to a decision even though school is about to begin. So in a last-ditch effort to get you to transition art into a hobby, your parents offer to buy you a new car if you switch majors. Plus, they'll pay for community art classes. Feeling that this deal is too good to pass up, you agree. And so in this instance, they have found the dollar point at which sometimes we call this sellout, right? But from a technical term, this is the point at which you are indifferent between those options. So basically what you're saying is, yeah, you know what? If I get a new car and I'm still able to pursue my art in a hobby form, have some art classes, I am indifferent to becoming an engineer, right? It's worth it to me to go to those engineering classes if I get these other side payments. Okay? If you said, no, look, I'm going to be an art major, period, you can't stop me, I'm not going to take any side payments, then that would reflect the fact that your indifference point is either very high or doesn't exist, right? In economics, so we typically say, well, that everybody has an indifference point. It just might be out of the range of, what someone could actually afford to pay. So maybe if your parents said, well, I'll give you $1 million, you would change, but they're obviously not going to give you $1 million. And the reality is that compensation happens all the time. So we see this a lot in add-ons to bills. So this happens all the time in policy making. This is why we get so many amendments to bills that appear to have nothing to do with the original legislation, right? So you have these omnibus bills where it's ostensibly, say, about farming, but you have things about building bridges, and you have things about roads, and you have things about our tax policy, all combined into this policy. And that is the reason that we have that is because those things are compensations to get people to vote for it, right? So maybe the senator from Alabama doesn't want to vote for this policy. They don't agree with it. But what they really think is important is some legislation that's going to create economic incentives or promote economic well-being in their state. Right? So they say, look, I'll vote for that, but you have to add on to it this thing that I think is really important, right? This is my compensation point. Okay, so let's look at an example. So let's pretend like we had 3 towns, Johnstown, Smithtown, and Megatown. Okay? And Johnstown and Smithtown are small communities, and Megatown is where all of the like goods and services and shops and things are. And that right now, there really isn't a way for the people of Johnstown and Smithtown to get to Megatown. Okay, so let's pretend like there's this big river, and this bridge doesn't exist. So the option is either they can build the bridge, or they can develop a ferry, so that the people of Johnstown and Smithtown can get to Megatown. So the bridge would be a lot more convenient for the people of Johnstown, because it would be right next to their town. People of Smithtown would have to drive all this way to get there. Whereas the ferry would likely be either in a middle location or it would be closer to Smithtown. Okay? So how would these communities decide what the best solution is? The answer is that they would do a cost-benefit analysis. So there are a couple of steps to cost-benefit analysis. So the first is figuring out who has standing and whose costs and benefits count, right? So, for example, in this example here, are Johnstown, Smithtown, and Megatown are all of their opinions important? Is one town more important than the other town? How do you answer these questions? And the answer is that it's not as simple as it sounds. Figuring out who has standing and whose costs and benefits count is a quite complicated issue. And it's one, when we think back to what we learned in the problem definition, you can begin to understand why it's so difficult, right? Because there are multiple competing interests. Different people have different sense of what is a need, what sense of security should be employed, whose values should dominate. So this is a very challenging question, but that's the first step. The second step is enunciating the policy alternatives. And so in this case that we're looking at, you have either the bridge or you have the ferry. But you want to make sure that you have the necessary details to flesh out those 2 policy alternatives. The third step is identifying the outcomes associated with each policy. And so what we might do is draw out the whole thing, okay? So on the left here, we see that the problem is a lack of access to town. So there are 3 options. 1, we can maintain the status quo and just maintain the fact that there isn't a way for those 2 towns to get to Megatown, right? The second option is that we can build a bridge, right? And so this has outcome 1. And the third solution is that we develop ferry service, which is outcome 2. So what are those outcomes? So you have some kind of economic prosperity, plus you have the bridge of the infrastructure, and developing ferry service, you have some kind of economic prosperity plus the development of the ferry. And what you're trying to figure out is what has the greater cost and the greater benefit in those 2 options. So once we have identified the outcomes associated with each policy, including our unintended outcomes, the time frame for those outcomes, etc., then we attach values to the outcomes that we have identified, right? So what is it worth to have a ferry service? What is the economic prosperity likely to be? And we're going to compare those, right? We're going to compare the outcome of the bridge to the outcome of the ferry. And we're going to, in addition, compare the economic prosperity, which includes things like increased local revenues, increased gross domestic product, increased tax revenues, etc. We're going to compare the economic prosperity that would be created by building a bridge versus creating a ferry. Okay. And so let's look at what this might look like. So obviously these are completely made up numbers. But let's pretend like the cost of building a bridge at first is quite expensive, right? So the cost is $2,000 and there is not a lot of benefit in that first year. But remember that we need to be able to account for the fact that things have different values over time. And so we're not just going to look at year one. We're going to look for a 5-year time span. And so after year one, the cost is only $200, right, per year, whereas the benefits increase exponentially. And we see that the total cost, $3,000 versus total benefits, $3,500, that the bridge meets our requirement of the benefits exceeding the cost. In contrast, the ferry is cheaper, right? The overall costs are cheaper at $2,600, but the benefits are also less, right? So not only are they less in absolute terms, so we have a $1,400 difference in the value of benefits, but they're also less than the costs, right? So in this case, the costs are not less than the benefits. The benefits do not exceed the costs. And so if we were taking these examples and trying to make a decision with them, the answer using cost-benefit analysis would be to pick the bridge, right? Because even though the initial cost is higher, or the costs overall are higher, the benefits are also higher, and the benefits exceed the costs. Now, as we'll talk about in a few slides, clearly cost and efficiency are not the only considerations. So, for example, if we go with the bridge, even though the benefits exceed the costs, it looks like one town is incurring most of the costs of that. Let's go back and look at our diagram. So Smithtown is incurring most of the costs of having this bridge in terms of inconvenience, in terms of the cost of getting to the bridge, etc. Right? And so equity is also a consideration that we have to take into account. We'll talk about exactly what we mean by equity here in a second. And that really is a segue into talking about the limitations of cost-benefit analysis. So there are multiple limitations. The first is that data collection is hard. It's difficult to find the measures, the values, do the forecasting to actually have cost-benefit analysis. The second is this focus on efficiency, which means that we're only focused on how big is your pie, right? Like who is getting the, like, we're only focused on maximizing benefits. We don't really care who gets those benefits and who incurs the costs. The next one is that how we account for jobs in an economic sense is very challenging because jobs have multipliers, and the way that we account for that is difficult. So for example, when we create an engineering job, we're not just creating that single job, right? Because that engineer is going to take their $100,000 or $150,000 income. They're going to go out into the community and they're going to go to restaurants and they're going to go to the movies and they're going to buy groceries and they're going to buy a house. And so they are contributing to the development of other jobs. Okay, and so the higher the salary, the higher the prestige of the job, the more additional jobs they create. So the person who works at McDonald's flipping burgers at minimum wage has significantly less income to go out into the community and create additional jobs, right? And in fact, they might be using government services to supplement their income. And so the way, though, that we assess the value of jobs is really hard, because in addition to that monetary value, in addition to the multiplier effects, how do you monetize, how do you value unemployment in terms of morale and in terms of ability to attract additional businesses? And it's just a really, really complicated thing to do. And this is probably the most important thing, is that it doesn't speak to societal impacts, right? We really are not talking about the way that things affect society or the way that one group benefits over the other. We are mostly looking at just the value of these costs and benefits. And you can get some of the costs and benefits, the societal costs and benefits, into your cost benefit analysis simply by saying, one of the, for example, in the unemployment instance, let's say you have a big project that you want to do. You want to do a big development project. You're trying to decide whether to do it or not. And employment is one of those options. Well, you could have an item that says, the societal benefit of unemployment is an increase in happiness overall or something like that, or a decrease in crime. And so you can get at that in some ways, but that is difficult to monetize. And so I want to give you an example about why cost benefit analysis, why it can be challenging to not account for who benefits and who loses. So when I graduated from high school, I did AmeriCorps. And we traveled around to a lot of different communities doing these service projects. And one of the communities that we worked in was Anniston, Alabama, which is an outer suburb of of Atlanta, Georgia. And so it's not exactly a suburb, but it's like a bedroom community for Atlanta. And Anniston, Alabama had just gotten crapped on by basically everybody. And so it's a perfect example of the concentration of costs because, so in Anniston, there was a chemical weapons incinerator. Monsanto had dumped PCBs into the water because the Monsanto plant was in the area, and they had dumped it into the water to the point that you could put a fish into the water and it would die within 10 or 15 seconds. They had an excess of lead, and prior to understanding really like what lead does to the human body, they had ground it up and used it to fill in backyards so that significant portions of children had lead poisoning. In addition, it was in Tornado Alley. It was very poor. It was extremely difficult for them to attract economic development. And so what you saw was this community that was incurring all of the costs of these things. And so when they were deciding, for example, where to put the chemical weapons incinerator, somebody sat down and probably did a cost-benefit analysis. And what they said was, you know what, the benefits of putting it in this community totally outweigh the costs. Let's put it in Anniston. But no one was paying attention to the fact that they already had all these other problems and that a single community was incurring all of these costs. So it's extremely important that we use cost-benefit analysis as one tool, but that we also account for who is receiving costs, who is receiving benefits, who is likely to be hurt by these policies. And the goal is that we distribute both the costs and the benefits widely so that no single community is getting all the benefit or all the cost. So in addition to those challenges, you also have the fact that cost-benefit analysis is very subjective. So you have omission errors, which means that you leave things out. So maybe there are costs and benefits that you just didn't think of or that you couldn't foresee. And there's also a danger that you end up double counting a cost or a benefit because you do it in multiple ways. You can also overload one side of the equation. So for example, if you're looking only at direct costs, but you're looking at both direct and indirect benefits, then you can really overvalue the benefits. Or vice versa, if you're only looking at direct benefits and you're looking at both direct and indirect costs, you can really overvalue the cost side of it. It's also challenging to know what the appropriate discount rate is. And so as I mentioned before, this is one of the ways that, this is one of the things you kind of have to be leery about because you can skew the results by the discount rate that you choose. And further, not everything has a value, or something might have a value to one person and not to another. In addition, you might even agree that something has a value, but it might be very valuable to one person and not valuable to another. And these are really these sort of intangibles, right? And so it's really, really challenging to actually do that. An alternative way of assessing policy is with equity. And so equity, like happiness or like many of the other things that we talk about as important in life, is a somewhat elusive concept. And so the reason that it's elusive, or the reason that it's not super clear, is that we don't necessarily have definite explanations of what is fair. So, for example, one definition of equity is uniformity, right? So that everybody gets the same thing. But what is equal is not always fair. And so you can think about this if you come from a family with siblings, right? At least in my family, my parents would be very clear that you don't always get what your siblings have, because that isn't always what is fair. Like, you have different needs, and equal is not always the best outcome. So there are multiple ways to think about equity. So one is horizontal equity, which is a measure of how much similar people are in similar situations are treated equally. So this might be, you can think about horizontal equity in our classroom. So, what you would want from me, right, when we're assessing equity, is that all of the students are treated in the same way, right? That you're all graded on the same standard, that we're not showing, I'm not showing preferential treatment to a single student, right? And so you're evaluating the degree to which other students, people like you, in the same situation of the classroom, are treated the same. Alternately, we could look at vertical equity. And so this is a measure of fairness that reflects how economically privileged, or not just economically, but the privileged in general, are treated relative to the less privileged. And so this might be a measure of the degree to which the rich pay more than the poor, or when we're talking about what we call regressive taxes. So things like like sales tax, where everybody pays the same rate. We want to know, the degree to which the poor end up taking on a disproportionate burden as compared to the rich. Or you might look at the extent to which the poor receive social benefits as compared to the wealthy, etc. Right? So you can look at it in terms of economic equity, but you can also look at it in terms of other dimensions of privilege. And so you can look, for example, we talked about that one group can be privileged over another group when their needs or values are the ones that are met, right? And so when there are groups with competing needs and one group is privileged in a policy, you can evaluate the degree to which how much is that equity different, or how much is that outcome different than those who have less privilege. Another type of equity would be intergenerational equity, which is the measure of the degree to which policies treat different generations fairly. And you could keep going on with this of investigating different types of equity, because in the end, what you're just looking at is the extent to which two groups are treated similarly or differently. One of the real challenges in policymaking is that inequity and efficiency is often inequitable, and that efficiency and equitability are often in conflict with one another. So we can think about this in terms of what we call the cake metaphor, which efficiency is about using resources in a way that creates the largest possible cake, regardless of how the slices are cut and allocated. Equity, in contrast, is about dividing the pieces in a way that society deems fair. And this is very important, because when we talk about fairness, this has to do with our society's conception of fairness. And so in the United States, we have a pretty high expectation for equity, at least in principle. Okay, and we expect that at least everyone has equal opportunity. Whether or not that actually happens is neither here nor there. That is the expectation. In contrast, so you have countries, for example, like India when they employed the caste system formally, where the society as a whole identified social strata as being sort of an inherent, intractable reality, and accepted the fact that those people of different castes or different classes would be treated differently. And not just differently like, oh, this is what is fair, but no, in ways that were really, really inequitable and that in our society, in our terms, would be considered unfair. But to reiterate, the key is that an efficiency consideration wants just the most benefits, period. And an equity consideration wants those benefits to be distributed in a fair way, and the cost as well to be distributed. The challenge is that equity and efficiency can be at odds with one another. Some policies that promote equal slices for all can diminish the size of the cake. And this happens, according to economic theory, for a variety of reasons. The underlying argument is that any policy that's trying to promote equity by redistributing resources diminishes the size of the cake because it creates two incentives that are likely to diminish overall productive capacity of the economy, right? Which, if you think about the cake as the economy or the cake as the benefit, when you take resources from one group and give them to another group, when you redistribute them, the economic argument argues that that will fundamentally reduce the amount of benefit or the size of the economy, etc., for two reasons. And the one is that redistribution, the argument goes, creates an incentive for those who are receiving that incentive to not to work as hard. And the second is that those who end up getting money taken away from them end up having an incentive not to work as hard or create as much wealth because they don't want to be penalized via taxation, right? So in the second instance, you can think about somebody who is right on the edge of being in the highest tax bracket. And if they make another $1,000, they'll have to pay, 40% of their income versus if they stay where they are, they're only paying 32% or whatever. I'm making up those numbers, but well, they have an incentive not to make that extra $1,000 because they'll end up paying way more in taxes than they earn than that extra $1,000 gives them. Okay. And that's sort of the way the argument goes. On the first point, it would be essentially saying that if you pay for someone, you can think about, actually, let's take this out of a political context. We all know that guy or girl who lives in their parents' basement indefinitely playing video games, right? And the point of what this would be saying is, look, that kid actually has very low incentive. If their parents are paying for everything and they're doing their laundry and cooking their meals, he doesn't have an incentive to get up and go and work, right? Why would you leave your parents' basement if you were not internally motivated to do so if everything you needed was provided for you? And so that's the sort of fundamental argument here, because you can think about redistribution on that micro level, because you're taking from the parents who have the money and giving it to the child who doesn't. And so these are considerations, but the point that I really want to leave you with is that efficiency is an important consideration. Cost-benefit analysis is essential for allowing us to compare dissimilar things. But it isn't the only thing that is important. We have to take into consideration the community values, the fairness of the policy, the distribution of benefit and costs. And as we'll talk about next week, we also have to consider things like, is a policy politically feasible? What are the unintended consequences that it's going to have, etc. And so this is one way to evaluate between options and choose one policy option. So once we have our problem figured out, we've identified what the policy alternatives are, we're trying to choose the best one, and this is one way to do that. For this week, so you have your cost-benefit analysis lecture you're listening to now. You should have already listened to your to the policy alternatives lecture. And then the final lecture is talking about energy independence and really looking at how how policy alternatives are different based on the way that we define our problem. You have readings that correspond with these. The readings for energy independence are congressional testimony from one is from an oil CEO, an oil company CEO, and the other is from the head of a advocacy group, like an environmental advocacy group. So I think those are really interesting. I would really highly recommend that you read them because it gives you a good sense of what a congressional testimony might look like and what a policy professional might be doing. In addition, you have your discussion post. I should have changed this. So it was due Thursday. It's now due Saturday by 11:59. You're getting that extra time because of the delay in the lectures. And your response post is still due on Sunday by 11:59 p.m. If you have any questions, as always, please email me or set up a time for office hours. And I hope you're having a great week. There's one more lecture for this week, so I will talk to you then. Okay, bye-bye.